Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome to episode 5. How are you doing, Carrington?
I'm good. I'm excited I can't believe we're already on 5.
I know. This is good stuff. I think we're covering some good topics.
I hope
I
so.
mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I think the only thing I want to do on this podcast is find a space for us to discuss either The Bachelorette or Bravo TV, but you don't watch any of that, so
No, you're going to have to find a new co-host. I'm
another
sorry.
co-host. Because there's a lot going on right now in the Bravo
Yeah.
world, but I digress.
Chris Harrison got fired, didn't he? Like that was a big story.
He got fired. There's Real Housewives going to jail. I mean,
Oh my.
it's madness. You should jump on this.
Okay.
But let's talk about weddings because I think that's why people are listening to a podcast called The Virtual Wedding Planner. So
I think you're right.
I think so. We've talked a lot about budgeting and all that stuff, but today we thought it would be helpful to talk to you guys about how to select your venue so that when you get through the planning process and you're getting your contract, there aren't any like surprises along the way.
Right.
We have compiled a list of questions that we think are important to ask your venue. Right. And Carrington, at what point do you recommend that couples ask these questions?
Well, so I think in the initial phase, you're kind of doing your first net casting and your research and you're doing that online and you're kind of collecting, maybe you're reaching out an initial inquiry and they're sending you package information. And I think, that has a lot of good information, but I think when you're narrowing it down to maybe, let's say 3, 4, even 5 venues, and maybe you're setting up site tours, then I think that's a good time to sit down and kind of compile your list of questions, which we're going to give you, and talk to the venue coordinator about those at that time. I think it's also helpful if you're able to do an in-person site tour, to be able to ask those questions in person, because then you can kind of talk through the logistics and see the logistics of those on site.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. I also think if you're listening to this podcast or watching us on YouTube, hi, that if you've already contracted with your venue, there are still some like really, really important questions that we want you to think about so that particularly when it comes closer to your wedding weekend and we're talking about scheduling, for example, like your rentals to be delivered, still want to ask the questions of when can that be set up?
Yep.
Is there an additional fee if we're doing a big installation on Friday and things like that?
Yep.
So let's just get into it. You ready?
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
So I think, as I just brought up, I think one of the most important things and the most critical parts that I want you to think about are those hidden fees and things that you don't know about. So off the bat, number one, I think the number one thing that couples don't think about, or when you're touring a venue. So for example, if the venue includes food and beverage, some venues will just give you a per person cost, right? So out the door, or I'm sorry, not even out the door, like at the end of the day, you're going to have the meal, the 5-hour bar, and X, Y, and Z, tables, chairs, all of that. But what it might not be including is tax and gratuity. Right. We're based in North Carolina, and that can be anywhere from 27.5% to 37. Like there's a huge difference. And that is a massive chunk of your budget. So it's important to ask these questions. But I think, just off the bat, we're not always comparing venues. It's not always comparing apples to apples. And we have had, hundreds of conversations over the years with couples that say, well, we want to have a tented wedding in our home. And we will cover tented weddings on another episode, right? Because that's like
or 7
episodes, or just hire us. Like just at that point, just get a planner. If you're doing a tented wedding, call Carrington. I'll be busy. No, I love tented.
Or maybe not. No, I don't know.
But it's not always apples to apples, because some venues include, like I said, food and beverage, tables, chairs. Sometimes they include linens, all of that.
Sometimes they include nothing.
And
going into it, I think it's so important to understand that, when you're comparing. So we always recommend narrowing it down to, 2 to 3, maybe 4 spaces. So it's not completely overwhelming. Because I think once you sit down with all those contracts and once you're trying to figure out, okay, what's included in this, how many hours do I get, do I need to bring in a caterer? That's going to overwhelm you real quick, real quick, like, and you're going to want to pump the brakes. So we definitely think narrow it down, and then start asking those questions. So is catering included? Do I need to bring in a caterer? Are any rentals included, or am I literally starting from scratch? Because those are very big price variables when you're adding up your total venue fee. So I think, making a spreadsheet and just doing a comparison report. And that's one of the other things that we also offer with Virtual Wedding Planner is if you're getting overwhelmed with that comparison and trying to figure out what venue is best for you and what fits within your budget, we actually offer a venue comparison report service where we come into your market, and do the research for you, narrow it down, to 2 to 3 to 4 venues that we think are a great fit for you, and break down the pricing that's in an easy to understand format, which is what we want to teach you to do now.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because I do think it's when you're someone that hasn't been doing events and you don't fully understand all of the nuances that are involved, we do it all the time. So we can do this very easily. We don't have emotion or, all of those big things at this point, because usually when you are deciding upon, and we talked last time about date, our last episode was, so if you're deciding, date versus venue first. So if you haven't listened to it, go back to number 4, because I thought was a really helpful conversation. But at this point, it might be like, okay, we're set on September 23rd. That's our wedding anniversary. That's our wedding date. It's the first date we went on, all this stuff, but your venue's not available now. And so that, there's just a lot of emotion. So usually we just break it down with you, but let's talk about it now. So I think the questions like Carrington just mentioned, is a caterer included? That's pretty obvious off the bat. Usually on their website, they're going to do that. The other thing I want you to ask is if they don't have catering in-house, you certainly need to know who the caterers are on the list. Right. Do you have to pay a fee for that caterer to be there? Sometimes, oftentimes, caterers pay a fee back to the venue at usually about 10%, 6 to 10%, which can be pretty high. So these are just the things you need to ask. And again, we'll have a whole other episode on catering because that is such a critical part to your wedding. But it's just like, hey, I need to find a venue. So you got to find the venue first, and then you can fill in the caterers. But I think the most important thing is when you're touring a venue, we need to know what your most likely out the door cost is going to be. So I don't want you just to ask what the food and beverage minimum is, because when you're doing that, I want you to ask, what is a realistic cost for, offering entree choices or doing family style or a buffet or stations or whatever for
an open
bar for 5-6 hours plus, 250 guests, and get that cost, and always ask them on the high end. The thing I don't want you to do is contract on the high end. So if your invite list is at 220, I don't want you contracting for 220 people. I don't even want you contracting for 200. I want you to contract for 165 people, right? The key to that is I want you to make sure that the venue can accommodate 225 people.
Yes.
But, go into it with that kind of, don't contract on the high end, because then you're going to start doing all of these add-ons that you don't necessarily need to do. So
and they're always going to be willing, as long as the space can accommodate, they're always going to be willing to add on to your contract. They're not going to be as motivated to remove from your contract. And in most times that they just won't.
Yeah, absolutely. So you want to be really conservative with how you contract your venue. And then from there, you certainly do want to know the food and beverage minimum. But then what I want you to do is say, what are the consequences if we don't meet that food and beverage minimum? On most venues that have a minimum, you're just going to pay a cash difference between the two. Or we've done it a lot. Right. We can upgrade to a longer bar, top shelf, added late night snack, things like that. So the other thing is finding out like, what are the rates? Certainly. Like, what's the difference between a Friday and a Saturday? What's the difference between, and I think, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but we're seeing a lot right now where Friday and Saturdays aren't that different of a cost. It's kind
Not
of,
anymore. I think, I
Mhm.
think, bef- I, I think we've come into a place where Friday and Sundays are now super normal, quote unquote, normal wedding days. And
Right.
it's become more socially acceptable. And so venues have adjusted their pricing accordingly. I think we're also seeing that in venues that are in high demand because they can book a Friday or a Sunday or even a Thursday at a peak rate. So they're going to. So I think that's still a great question to ask because if you are open to a Friday or Sunday wedding or a weekday wedding, then there sometimes is some price advantage. But I think we're seeing that slowly disappear. And maybe that's a side effect of coming through COVID. And maybe we'll see that kind of normalize in 2022, but I'm afraid it might be on the way out.
I agree. I agree. I also think it's important then after, yeah. So finding out the venue fees, what all is included. Does that
Mhm,
include vendor setup? So if you get a
mhm,
6 hour, 8 hour package, does that
mhm.
also include when the vendors can arrive? So
Right.
oftentimes for our weddings, they're on a larger scale. So we might start installation on like Wednesday, Thursday,
Mhm,
certainly Friday. And
mhm.
oftentimes that might come with a higher fee.
Yeah.
So just getting to know all those things ahead of time. Then what I want you to do is find out what is, like we just mentioned, what is the venue's capacity? And I don't mean a cocktail style reception, but you really want
Mhm,
to seat it. I want you to go into it having an idea of I want to seat all of my guests or,
mhm,
whatever that is. And then
mhm.
from there, you can make sure that one, if you love the venue and you have to scale back on your guest list, or two, you need to look at a different venue. So it's really
Right.
important to know their capacity. And what I always think is great is if you're certainly at a hotel or anything like that, what is it? Do they have a sample floor plan for your guest list?
Yeah.
So you can just see an idea.
Well, and also I think it comes another conversation that I think is on our list is what's the rain plan? What's the inclement weather plan?
Mm-hmm.
And what does it look like if I'm planning for an outdoor ceremony or an outdoor portion, whether it's cocktail hour ceremony or even dinner? What does it look like for plan B and C? And some of the backup plans are not ideal. And I think you have to be comfortable with that and go into it assuming that you might have to go to plan B and
Yeah,
be comfortable with plan B. We never want our clients to hate plan B
never.
because you're inevitably going to go to plan B. Um
Guarantee if you
and
don't like your plan B, you will have plan B at your
you're
wedding.
gonna go to plan B.
Yep.
And that's heartbreaking for you. It's heartbreaking for us. So that's such an important question to ask up front when you're touring these venues. Um, if I'm moving my ceremony inside, does that mean that it's in the same space as my reception? And does that mean that we have the ability to flip the space?
Mhm.
Or does it mean that my guests are literally going to be sitting at their tables?
Mhm.
Um, to while we're getting married. So these are all really important questions to cover and make sure that you are comfortable with the answers before you either one accrue additional costs for a tent if that has to go up, or you're stuck in a plan B that you absolutely abhor. Um, so
Look at Carrington
definitely
with Carrington has the big words. Carrington has the big
word
vocabulary.
of the day. Word of
Two
the
of us.
day.
Aaron is Googling a porn. No, I'm just kidding. um, I think that's really important. I think we have seen in the many years of like guests, and I know the venue in my mind where, and you know it too, the venue, the cocktail hour backup plan is like a tight hallway.
Mhm.
Everyone's packed in there like sardines.
It's
There's
hot.
windows. It's hot as Hades. Your guests are miserable. They're drunk by like 20 minutes into cocktail hour because they're
If they can
hot.
get to the bar
Right.
because it's so crowded.
Preach on that. The other question, and everyone hates a bar line. Like there's two things that people
Everybody
hate.
hates a bar line.
Well, there's a few things. Two, number one is a bar line, and two, there's always the one lady usually a blonde with a high ponytail at Carrington wears blonde. If you're listening to this, Carrington is very blonde and very high ponytail right now.
Very high ponytail today.
And you know, it's true. This woman will come up to us within the first 10 minutes of the music starting to tell us how loud the music is. And do we know how loud it is? I'm like, well, this is a 22-piece band. So she's loud. She's
at a big party.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, those are like the things that we know will happen. But I think, so it's being comfortable with what those plans are, really saying to them, okay, comfortably, and then asking them, like, how many bartenders can we have? How many people, like, how many servers do you have per guest? You know, I always like to say, like, one server per 20 guests, 15,
25 people.
Yeah. I mean, ideally I would love one server per 10 guests, but that cost goes way up with service fees, but that's okay. Like if that's important to you. And then I also think if bar lines drive you nuts, it's a little bit off topic, but not really, but just making sure that we can pass drinks as guests come into cocktail hour so that the bar isn't super hit.
Right.
But you want to find out, like, where is the bar at happy hour or happy hour or cocktail hour? Everyone's happy there too. So you just want to make sure that you have an idea and understanding about the flow of the space before you book it. And just really making sure, again, we want to know what those hidden backup fees are. And then you also want to make sure, again, like I said, is there staff involved with setup and breakdown? So for example, if you know that you don't want the hotel ballroom chairs and you want to get an upgraded chair or whatever, wherever it is. And again, I want to back up and say, like, this conversation is really right now, this topic is really based on like venues that have full staff, kind of full service venues, you know, catering, whether it's a ballroom or whatever. If you're renting these chairs, do you have to pay the rental company to do it, or will their staff do it? Usually we pay the rental company, right? Like, and then when can rentals be delivered? I want you to make sure, like, if you are writing notes, which I hope you are, if you're not, pause, get a piece of paper, open the notes on your phone. If you are booking a venue right now, or if you have one booked, I want you to call your venue coordinator and find out when rentals can be delivered and when they have to be picked up. There have been, I don't even want to think about how many countless thousands of dollars our couples have had to handle and pay for because venues don't tell us that there's a wedding there on Sunday afternoon. Your wedding's there on Saturday night. It ends at 1 and everything has to be out that night.
So you're inevitably looking at late night strike fees. And some venues are very, very strict about it, whether there's a wedding the next day or not. You have to be out by midnight, like you weren't ever there. So again, another good question to ask to avoid fees. And the whole reason we're going through this list, a lot of it comes back to, we don't want you to spend money where you do not have to.
Absolutely.
Or where you are not expecting to. And I think because, you know, typically you do this once, and we do this a lot. Why would you think to ask that? Because, you know, you think it's pretty straightforward, but it's not always. And it's not always in black and white. It may be tiny in the bottom. But these are all really, really good questions to ask prior to signing the contract, so that you think you're signing a contract for, you know, a $4,500 space rental fee, but you sign it and then you get into the process of planning and you're adding $1,000 late night strike fee, and you're adding a $300 fee to set up chairs, and you're doing a cleaning fee because you've decided to do a confetti cannon or something like that. You know, these are all fees that we really don't want you to pay if you don't have to, or if you're not prepared to do so.
I think that's the thing. Yeah. I think and usually these are fees that get accrued closer to your wedding date, maybe like a month out. And I think there's nothing worse. And now, you know, I think the point of one of the biggest things of this podcast is, like, we want you to have the knowledge of our mistakes.
Yeah.
So I'm going to admit this on the podcast, but don't tell any clients. But what we've learned over the years is, if we don't ask this upfront, like 6 months, a year out, we will find out the week or so out.
The hard way.
No matter yeah, I mean, and no matter, even if we know that like we're asking this question, it doesn't mean the venue's not going to book something the week before. So I want you just to be cognizant of those
Mhm.
things and making sure that you're just not caught off guard, because that's a really bad feeling. And that's
It
money that
is.
you're probably planning on using on your honeymoon. You know, it's not
Yeah.
$200. It's usually $2,000. So
Yeah.
something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Great. So then I think the final question that I think is really important to ask your venue, and maybe Carrington, I said final, but maybe you have more,
No, it's
is
okay.
just really making sure that, again, all of the things you know up front. So I want you to ask them, how many weddings do you have a weekend here?
Mhm.
Is it because there's some venues that rent out for the whole weekend. I mean,
Yeah.
you get the entire place for the whole weekend. The
Mhm.
other thing is like they're a hotel, so they do maybe 4 to 6 weddings a weekend. So I want you to know, and just know that like you might see another bride on her wedding day, but just I want you to know that like a
Yeah.
recent
And
wedding we
that
just
yeah, that may not be a problem. I mean, it doesn't have to mean it's a bad thing, but you don't want to walk around the corner and there's another wedding gown and you're like, "Oh,
can I
I
tell a
thought I was getting
story?
married here."
Can I
Yeah.
tell a
Yeah.
story?
I want to
Okay,
hear a
you
story.
guys, picture yourself. So it's your wedding day. This is what happened at one of my weddings about 4 years ago. 5, maybe 5 years ago. Oh gosh, it was probably more than that. I think it was more than that. The bride, it was a wedding venue that had multiple weddings all the time. They had like 3 different spaces, all of it. The bride had on a very popular Haley Page collection dress. She walked around the corner and there was another bride in her gown. The brides had the same dresses. I
It's
can't
just
even
not
imagine.
good.
It's not good. And one bride was like 7 feet tall and the other bride was like 5'3", which is what I am. So I'm allowed to say that. Like the stark difference between between it, it
Just
it was horrible. It was horrible, horrible. And they styled them very differently, but it was just like, oh my, and both of their faces fell. Both of them fell. So you just okay, you can't really, maybe you can
you
ask
can't
the
I
bride,
mean,
find out what gown she's wearing, but the chances of that are quite slim.
most people are not going to do that.
It was shocking.
I think
I
and
died.
Aaron and I have talked about, just digressing a bit. Aaron and I have talked about whether or not we're going to share some just crazy stories that have happened to us over the years of planning. Um, we're definitely going to write a book one day. Um,
You'll have to write it. I'm a
but
terrible
but
writer.
that's one of the things. Like you can't predict that.
You can't.
You can't even make it up. It's just the way it is with events.
It's crazy.
It's unfortunate, but true.
I mean, I'll never forget it, but it wasn't
No,
my
I
wedding
didn't.
day. But
No,
I
and
think
I
so.
doubt they'll forget about it either, but maybe
No,
one day they'll be able to laugh about it.
I don't know. I don't know about that. But I think it's important, again, that you understand the dynamics of the space and just feel good about your
Mhm,
space. I
mhm.
think no space is perfect, no space is
Right,
ideal all the way. But I do think
right.
that if you're at a venue that does multiple events a day or a weekend, that you just get clarity on what that schedule
Yeah,
looks like.
right.
But then if it's something like you're doing a tent or all of that, this is kind of, I mean, again, speaking of not comparing apples to apples, a tent versus a ballroom wedding are not even close to on the same planning style. So we'll talk through that on a different episode. But
Yeah,
I hope this was helpful. I think choosing your venue is so important. It's such a specific thing to your wedding. But
yeah,
know that if for some reason you don't get your ideal date or you don't get your ideal venue, I promise you're not going to feel bad about it after your wedding is here, right?
no,
Like
no.
you can make
And
your
I think
wedding how you want it, no matter where it is.
the
Yeah.
takeaway from this whole thing, and we digressed a little bit here and there, but it's all good information,
Yeah.
is just ask the questions. Just, make sure that you are clear on what's happening and when it's happening and what's allowed and what's not allowed, and actually read the contract. Like,
Read
read
the
it,
contract.
please.
Yeah.
Um, you would never believe how many people just literally
Yeah.
just sign, and then they come back and they're like, "Oh my God, I agreed to a $25,000 food and beverage minimum and I have 100 people."
And valet is $25 a car.
Yeah. So just read
Think about
it.
valet.
If you take anything away from this conversation, it's read the contract and read it again, and then have somebody else read it.
Yeah.
And it'll save you a lot of heartache on the back end.
Totally. Yeah, I agree. Well, thanks guys. Thanks for
Yeah, thanks for
listening or
joining us.
watching. If you like what you're listening to, we'd love if you subscribed and left us a nice review.
Yeah.
As always, you can visit our website. It's virtualwedplanner.com. You might notice there's a different URL than the last episode, but we changed it to make it a little easier. So it's virtualwed, WED planner.com. So thanks so much, and we'll talk to you soon.
See you
Bye.
soon.